Good morning, Saturday, March 26, 2022. Ed Larkham here, and welcome to Simple Human Action. I wanted to use this episode to review the background to our current monetary system. Western countries, including the US, Europe, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and many others, continue to use the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. So what does this mean? These countries have their own currencies, but for the most part, international trade settlements are done in US dollars. The purpose has been ostensibly to provide a stable benchmark for countries to be able to send and settle international transactions between each other. The general idea was so that all countries, including the US, would be able to trade between nations and depend upon a stable monetary instrument to make economic calculations for their own trade requirements. The term petrodollar has been used to describe trade in oil with the Middle East and indeed many countries around the world. And that is a term most of us are familiar with. However, there is a vast chasm between an economic tool for stability and trade and its application as a political weapon. Over the years, we've seen increasingly the dollar has become less of an economic media for promoting free trade between international economies, but more as a political cudgel. This monetary aspect of international tensions is mostly overlooked by the wider media when we look back over the events of the last 60 years. And in this vein, the world's reserve currency deserves a closer look and perhaps a re-evaluation in terms of its use for the purposes of free trade between nations. I'd like to provide a very brief review of our current monetary system as it relates to today's fiat currencies in Western economies. So this is a brief summary of the important developments in Western money since 1913. The intention is to paint in broad strokes the general developments in world finance from the inception of the World Federal Reserve to today's US dollar as the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in December 1913. Although, as presented to the public, its purpose was to stabilize the United States banking system and its economy, the reality was to become quite different. In one stroke, it was to centralize all financial authority into a very small number of hands. Those hands were to be the most powerful bankers in the world. One should not have any illusions about the intent here. At this point, it is most relevant to look at the 6 men who essentially conceived the methodology of creating the world's most powerful central bank in the world. I'd like to point out that these people individually, because they have backgrounds that are meaningful in considering their intent. First of all, Nelson Aldrich. He had been the head of the Republican Party, and in fact, he had become the chairman of the National Monetary Commission. This commission was designed to look into the problems of banking and the economy of the crisis in 1907. So he was intimately motivated with creating a banking system that would resist economic shock. Secondly, Henry Davison. He was a senior partner with J.P. Morgan. Abraham Andrew was Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, the Federal Treasury. Frank Vanderlip was president of National City Bank in New York. Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's subsidiary bank, Bankers Trust, situated in New York. And finally, but certainly not least, Paul Warburg. He was the senior partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company. He represented both the Rothschilds and the Warburgs of Europe in their American endeavor. Warburg in particular was the most attuned with what had become known as the Rothschild formula, It was to be applied explicitly to the economic monolith of the United States. It essentially meant that the consortium of bankers would lend to the US government for their spending requirements, and the security or guarantee for repayment would be, in the US taxpayer. Yes, nice work if you can get it. And therein was born the very mechanism through which the inflation of the money supply would happen. The banks had the guarantee of the United States government that the taxpayer would always be there to pay the interest on the ever-increasing debt. There is much more to be said on this point, and perhaps it will be the subject of future episodes. However, the First World War resulted in a spectacular bank credit. And by the end of the First War in 1918, the national debt levels across the Western countries had grown by an order of magnitude. The Europeans would have their own challenges that would have terrible consequences and fracture Europe for decades to come. In the United States, to stimulate their economy after the war years, inflationary practices were followed, and that led, of course, to the Roaring Twenties. This culminates in the stock market crash of 1929. Now, this was to be blamed on the so-called business cycle, the greed of the capitalists. However, upon appropriate analysis, it can only be blamed on the excessive credit cycle spawned by the lending practices of the larger institutional banks. In Europe, in the 1930s, it saw a period where the political chasm was created, and Germany slipped into a level of fascism from which there was to be no return. This culminated in the Second World War starting in 1939. This cataclysm needs no further comment by me, except to say that by 1944, when it appeared clear that the Allies would be victorious, the United States, the UK, France, and multiple other countries met at the Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. Just over 700 delegates from, I believe, 44 countries attended to discuss what the world's financial system would look like after the war. The resulting agreement, or actually it would be more appropriate to say disagreement, resulted in the United States choosing to use the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. It was ultimately agreed that international settlements for trade would be made with the United States dollar, and it would be backed by gold at $35 an ounce. This all sounded fine in principle, but the reality was that in the following decades, the United States, as issuer of the world's reserve currency, continued to inflate the money supply. Part of the reason for this was to produce dollars for other countries to be able to use, to be able to trade with international trade partners. But as the economist Robert Triffin pointed out in the mid-1960s, I believe, this could not be done without inflationary consequences. This actually became known as the Triffin dilemma, and that's worth reading upon if you have the opportunity. Compounding this issue, the United States was getting involved in a number of international conflicts, including Korea and Vietnam. The result immediately led to the inflating of the money supply and trading balances where a number of countries began to demand to convert their international trade settlements into gold rather than US dollars because of the inflation of the dollar supply. The president of France, Charles de Gaulle, actually went to the extent of taking French ships to New York to pick up their gold from US vaults. This action aligned with several other countries at the time that felt the same. This was to put a considerable dent in the US gold inventories, as you can imagine. The cumulative effect was that by 1971, famously, Richard Nixon announced that speculators in gold had forced him to protect the American public, and he closed what was called the gold window. This was the convertibility of gold with dollars. First announced as a temporary measure, it soon became permanent, and of course by 1976 all reference to convertibility to gold for the dollar was gone, and any mention of gold in terms of US currency had been eradicated. Ever since then, the world's reserve currency and all other Western currencies have been pure fiat and have been backed by nothing but the trust and faith and credit of the issuing nations. To cut a very long story short, for which I'm sure you'll be thunderously grateful, I'll just say that as a barometer of fiat money inflation, the United States debt has increased from $420 billion in 1971 to $30 trillion in 2022. When this same evaluation is made of all other Western economies over the same time frame, the realization is made that there is a rapidly escalating debt bubble being created for which there is no coming back from. In the very near future, there's going to be a lot of navel-gazing and wringing of hands and political equivocation about how they will convert all this debt into a new currency. If this currency is allowed to be fiat, and based on the misplaced trust in these same governments, then nothing will change and nothing will improve in the lives of all of those who work hard every day and try to make their lives as best they can. As you can see, we're long overdue for a return to sound money, where all people who are participants in their economies and as citizens of those countries will benefit from the stability of a stable currency. Economies around the world, with the ability to make economic calculation, with the confidence of knowing that money has stable and sound value, will return to prosperity for the greatest number of people. Inevitably, the modern Western monetary experiment in fiat currency is now rapidly approaching failure. It is clear that a discussion needs to begin immediately in all levels of society about how the citizens of their nations can regain control of their money. This is something that politicians are going to resist vigorously. But on a closing note, ask yourself this: who works for whom? Western ideas and ideals of liberty and freedom should not be so easily surrendered for indentured servitude. And on that note, I will leave you alone in peace. Thank you for watching and listening. Please consider hitting the like button and the subscribe button, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode on Simple Human Action.